attempt to adjust your radio. There is nothing wrong. We have taken control as to bring you this special show. We will return it to you as soon as you are grooving. Welcome to station WEFUNK.
Now you may be wondering, why am I coming to you with this funky talk on Jay's Analysis? Well, I'm going to tell you why, because this is straight out of Oklahoma, O-Funk. And what we're going to bring you today is the C-Funk. I'm talking about that cult funk, baby. Now, what do I mean by cult funk? Well, you're going to find out here in a minute why we tying this into P-Funk. This is jaysanalysis.com. After many requests, given our last talk on cults, and yes, I did get several emails and messages saying, when is James Kelley coming back? I want part 2 of the cult series. Give it to me now. I've got James Kelley back, and this time we're going to drink some Kool-Aid, baby. We're going to go Purple Saurus Rex, full blast, busting through walls just like Mr. Kool-Aid does with James Kelley. We're going to talk Jonestown, and he has done the research on this matter big time, and he sent me a piece that's going to be put up in the next couple days as well in tandem with this interview. James, how are you?
Great. How are you doing, Jay?
Doing excellent. I'm excited to talk Jonestown. I've read a couple books on this as well, and I know that you have put in a good bit of research in the last month, because I had people saying, can James come back this next week? And I said, look, he's coming back, but he wants to do hardcore research because that's the kind of dude he is. He doesn't like to approach a topic without being fully schooled on it. So I can guarantee you that the more time James takes, it's going to be well worth it.
I hope so.
So let's get into it. But before we do, we were just joking about, before we started, about this is my own little weird thesis of how different cults take on their own culture, I guess is the way we could say it. So you have Jehovah's Witnesses they'll have their own little weird styles of wearing these cheap looking 80s suits and fat ties, something that comes out of a thrift store, and they always dress this way. So if you pick up any watchtower, you'll see these same photos are still using it, the same kinds of artwork. I guess I don't know if it's the same dude that does every piece of art in the Watchtower magazine or what, but James, you had an interesting comment in regard to Pentecostals on this.
Sure, and I mean, just kind of the whole, charismatic fundamentalist Southern preacher. There are a few set of archetypal hairstyles that are allowed, it seems, at least to the outsider. One is the palmated side part. I don't know. You mentioned one. There's one that's kind of like Elvis hair. It's almost like a pseudo pompadour.
The puff, the white puff, like Jack Van Impe, Benny Hinn, they have the white puff.
Yeah, there's the white puff, and there's, I think it may be a kind of appropriation of the Elvis spirit.
I think that's a good point, and it may be tying it into the theatrics of Elvis's stage presence. That's what.
No, I mean, it's true, and I mean, if you think about it, Elvis sort of heading up or recapitulating the African American musical, acumen, and
right,
repackaging it for a wider America. It kind of has a parallel with the beginning of Pentecostalism. A lot of people aren't aware that the Pentecostal movement began in California.
It did, correct.
The Azusa
Street revival, right? Quote.
Yeah,
revival.
and it was an integrated church. Mm-hmm. It had black and white. It's only after the whole idea of the full gospel type idea, where you have to show that tongues, you have to show that you can handle serpents in some cases, but mm-hmm. you have to go through a certain number of steps where it's like, well, I have pretty much demonstrated, that I have the full spirit, so now I can preach and do this and that. Well, once I got to the South, of course, it became integrated, and all memory of the kind of more radical integrationist beginnings were forgotten, except Jim Jones didn't forget that.
That's what we're going to get to next, is Jim Jones. So that's a great segue. Let's talk Jim Jones. What's the best place to start? Because this is a huge topic with all kinds of books, all kinds of documentaries, you name it. just break us into it right away, Kool-Aid man.
Well, James Warren Jones, better known as Jim Jones, was born on May 13th, 1931, in Crete, Indiana. And quickly the family moved to Lynn, Indiana, which is where he's often said to be from. And I think in this milieu of small town Indiana, there weren't very many black people, but I think Jim Jones, his parents didn't really have a lot to do with him. His father was kind of a distant figure, a war veteran that had a lung ailment and didn't really engage with very many people. He was a man of few words. And his mother sort of took over. She was kind of an atypical woman for the time, in that she worked at a factory, worked long hours, and left Jim to his own devices. And she would leave babysitters, and little baby Jim would just roam around the streets. Reportedly, he would roam around the streets, and sometimes completely nude as a child, and he would scream obscenities at anybody who he came into contact with. And oftentimes he would soil himself, number one and number two, and walk around with it caked on his body.
So do we think that this is maybe a result of abuse, or do we think he had some kind of mental problems? Do we know?
Well, if you go to some of the people that knew Jim Jones, one is a guy, David Wise. I think I got the first name right, but his last name is Wise. Is a preacher who knew him in San Francisco, and he had a lot of experience with people who'd been abused. And he said, I believe Jim Jones was sexually abused when he was a child. We don't know if that's the case, but we do know that one thing I was able to pick up on in the sources I read about his childhood is that when he came into contact with adult figures that should have or could have given him some kind of structure, instead they either laughed at him. Local men about town, at the pool hall or the domino playing hall, would give him quarters and say, now you call me every name you can think of. And so this little crowd of men would gather around, and little Jim Jones, who had a gift of gab, as we all know, he could speak for hours and hours and hours as a preacher. And he was adept at cursing as a little bitty child, and was even witty with it, and would cause all the men in the town to laugh. And so this went on. And so if you think about psychologically, just from a layman's perspective, how damaging that is for a child to have someone say, you're going to get the attention, and you're going to be on a sort of stage with adults paying you heed in place of your absentee parents, and we're going to pay you to think of degraded, horrible things. Oh, and by the way, before we get very much, I'm going to quote Jones directly, and just for those who have listened to all my other, talks, there will be some off-color language, but I'll be citing other people, so it won't be me talking.
No worries there. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure most of your listeners don't care, but if I've got some people, that have all the kids sitting around the computer listening to this, I want them to know there's going to be some
put up some caveats here. So parental advisory sticker. Tipper Gore has shown up, and Tipper Gore is right now handing me a parental advisory sticker to put on this talk with James.
Hey, people have said I couldn't get arrested if I tried, and I'm going to prove them wrong today. We're going to have people coming in here and shutting me down, knocking on the front door.
Well, if this ever gets a larger audience than it has a pretty good audience now, but if Jason Analysis gets a larger audience, you might get some social justice warriors that go after you online and send some online hate your way. But I don't think it'll go beyond online, because I don't think those people are actually very dangerous. They're more so projecting crap online that they're not going to actually do. But
someone who did turn out to be dangerous is James Warren Jones. As a child, so he gets this kind of attention. Another thing that I found out is that he didn't get the attention from his mother, but his mother seemed to, in passing moments, as she's heating up a cold meal on the stove while little Jimmy's trying to soak up any drops of attention he can get, she would fill him full of these high ideals, like, you just need education, because she had a few years of college, back when that was a big deal for a woman to have the opportunity to do. And she'd always say, don't be like your father, make something of yourself. No one will help you, but you just need to hit those books and study. And that's where he found out about socialism. Was he read about Mao, he read about Lenin, and he read about socialism. And he had a formative experience as a child. He spoke about it later, and we have to be careful because, people mythologize, as we know, later on especially. But later, Jim Jones said, when I was a child, I lay there. Let me see if I'll just kind of paraphrase the quotation. He said, I laid there on my bed with the rain pouring through the roof, thinking, why am I poor? Why am I hungry? Why am I an outcast? And he said, then I got a beam of a beam of consciousness that I was a child of infinite spirit. He said, then at that moment, at age 5, I stopped praying and I realized one truth from within, and that is that there shouldn't be any poor and everyone should be equal. So he took that knowledge, and then as he grew up, he became a Methodist preacher, but he knew about the Pentecostal thing. So he started doing faith healings in Indiana churches. And at this same time, in the early 50s, as a young man, he started attending Communist Party meetings. And he said, well, I want to join this thing. And they said, no. As a Christian preacher, you need to just support us with your message and don't join the party. At least that was his story. So then he becomes Jim Jones, that is, becomes a pretty famous preacher in the 1950s in Indiana because he gave the same message that all the other Pentecostals gave in there, even though he was strictly speaking a Methodist, but he integrated all these Pentecostal themes into his sermons. And he also dropped the bomb on them. He said, but I want all whites and blacks to be in the same church. So this caused a lot of problems. And this is important too. At this time in Indiana, this is all before Jonestown. This is before People's Temple. He didn't even really have his own church at this point. But at this point in Indiana, he starts not just having a church, but he says, I'm going to develop my own group. First he called it, I think it was Wings of Deliverance was what he called his church. And then it changed it to People's Temple Full Gospel Church.
Now, quick question.
Yes.
To me, it sounds like maybe that's a concocted story looking back on his youth. I mean, what 5-year-old says, I saw a beam of light that told me I was infinite consciousness? I mean,
sure.
So this is his sort of back mythology, creating his own legend, I guess. But
good point, too, because we also know that in high school, there was a religion class, and they were talking about Greek and Roman myth gods,
mm-hmm.
and he was just intransigent. He would just slam his fist on the desk and say, no, that's not true, and he would start quoting from the Bible. And when he got to college, he had a roommate who said he had a little bit of a theological education, the roommate, whose name escapes me, but he would start to needle Jones a bit, and he would say, well, what do you think about church fathers? What do you think about Eastern Orthodox theology? And this just made Jones absolutely furious, and he would just start spouting scripture at that point. So, I mean, you hear a lot of people that had extended contact with him in his early life up into his teens and even early college years, where he said nothing about socialism. He said nothing about any of these things that he claimed was his core of what he did.
Very strange combination here. I mean, we tend to think of the fundamentalist rural small town mindset not meshing well with socialist ideas. Maybe in certain parts of Kentucky there's kind of an agricultural affinity for socialism or Marxism of some kind in certain sectors, but generally speaking, if we're thinking fundamentalist full gospel ideas, it doesn't tend to mesh well with something like Lenin. But
yes.
but my guess would be it will mesh well when we look at this from the perspective of showmanship, propaganda, and manipulating masses.
Yes, and also Jones, and this is just my analysis here, but looking at his whole life and what he ended up doing and what he started doing, he understood the kind of exaltation that people can feel when you bring them across a divide to a place that they never thought they would be. He would bring, you know, 76-year-old black ladies. He would make them read Chairman Mao, and there's a pathetic example of one where it's in Jonestown actually. There's a tape on YouTube, one of the Jonestown tapes that were found, where he says, "Did you read your Chairman Mao like I told you to?" And she said, "Yes, I did." And he said, "Well, what did Chairman Mao say that we needed to do?" And she goes, "Well, just be at peace." And he interrupts her and goes, "No, no, Chairman Mao didn't say anything about being at peace." He said, "Chairman Mao said something about a gun. What did he say?" And she's like, "Something about a barrel of a gun." And he's like, "Yeah, you know, the end." And it's just really weird how it may not have worked so well for that individual case, but what Jim Jones tended to do is he would say, "Well, you're a Christian. Well, I'm telling you that you need to actually curse." He would curse all the time. As time went on, when he got to California and then later in Guyana, he would curse not just as, "Well, this is what I do," but that this is part of what you have to do to throw off this capitalist Christian mentality, is you have to cross over. And he always joked there were these two ladies that he had sort of stolen from Father Divine's peace mission, and we can talk about Father Divine a little bit too, but he had stolen all these congregants from Father Divine. And he said there's only two ladies in this church that won't cuss, and they're two from the peace mission. And he's like, when we get these people from outside that leave as soon as I start cussing and calling them ends, he said, what we need to do is we need to get those two ladies and minister to them because they won't cuss. And then the whole congregation just bursts out laughing, because every other Christian, every other conservative Christian in that whole room, Jim Jones had convinced that you need to cuss.
Holy shit.
It's bizarre.
Now, okay, I understand too. I read, you would have a better sense of this probably. I read that his dad was a Quaker. Is that correct? So that might have some aspect to play here, if that's true.
It is true that his family had some devout Quakers in them, and the father didn't seem to really be very vocal about anything, but the mother, Lynette would deride the pious Quakers, her pious Quaker in-laws, and would say that it's just, the only thing that matters here is that people are getting pushed down. Another thing she did that may have led to his psychopathy is that she wouldn't be there to do all the nurturing things that a mother is supposed to do, but she would tell him that she would say, "Well, you do a lot of things that people look askance at, but the good outweighs the bad." And so she would also say, if anyone opposes you, she would focus on the fact that no one's going to criticize my family or my boy. So it was a kind of parent, that goes to the junior high school and starts, getting on the principals and the teachers when the child's at fault.
Oh,
We
yeah.
see a lot of that happening. Now, obviously, there's more than that going on, because not everyone that has that upbringing becomes a Jim Jones. But nonetheless, you have this idea that what matters is not the content of your action, but these ultimate high principles, which are very abstract, and which if anyone goes against you and what you say, it's those high principles they're attacking. So therefore, you can attack them with full force and have all these adults back you up. Whether you're right or wrong, it's immaterial. So that's part of what he's doing too.
I see. So, okay, so let's get into how this develops. What you mentioned, Father Divine. What is this? Tell us more about this.
Well, this kind of allows us to connect back to our last talk about the Nation of Islam. Nation of Islam, as I said in the past, it had its precursors. Precursor, one of them was the Moorish Science Temple of America. And of course, the precursor to the MSTA, Moorish Science Temple, was Marcus Garvey's UNIA. And the UNIA, one thing that it did, as I mentioned before, is it used the New Thought movement, this idea that, all you have to do is think. yourself as a successful middle class person, and that will become your reality.
You
So it's
cut
kind of like
you cut out a little bit there, but kind of like The Secret, basically. You're saying that the new thought is this positive thinking style stuff, right?
yes, and basically what we have developed out of that are what I call the Black American New Religious Movements, and that is Nation of Islam is the most you know well-known one. But you also have another which develops, which is the Peace Mission of a black preacher who called himself Father Divine. And what Father Divine did was say, okay, you can join my movement. We'll have soup kitchens and places to stay, and we'll take care of your basic needs. But you just give everything to us, and then you'll have a dormitory to live in. All women will live together. All males will live together, and there won't be any kind of sexual activity or anything like that. And everyone's father would be Father Divine,
Oh, wow.
and so the thing is of course, yeah, as always, there was a sexual scandal, and he actually later in life he married one of his, I think she was something like 20 or 30 years younger than him, one of his white followers, and she became the mother figure of the whole. And then they're like, well, why can how come you get to have a partner and we don't? And he's like, well, I'm God. And there's a famous court case where Father Divine had to go in a state court, and he said, and Father Divine taught that, he said, well, yes, he said the male and the female all began with a male and female cell, like I guess an amoeba or something. And he said, but I'm the first cell. He said, before there were male and female cells, there was me, and I was the only cell. So he said, if I decide I want to merge with a female reproductive cell, then I can do that. But you're kind of a lower derivation of me, so therefore you have to segregate yourself and be more like I was when I was the only cell. So everyone knows how cults work in the sexual vector, and that is the cult leader gets to have his pick of the litter. If he has contact with someone, then it's a blessing to them. However, if there's a conventional relationship or what have you, that's off limits, and he can control that.
Mm-hmm.
So that. It's interesting that in the 50s, Jim Jones, this is no joke, he actually decided to try to take over. Yes, so Father Divine was forced to sort of answer the question as to why he could have sexual relations and no one else could, because everyone else, it was kind of an enforced celibacy thing. You work in our soup kitchens, you get a place to stay, but it's all, there's no sexual activity unless you're Father Divine. So Father Divine had a sermon that he gave where he said, well, I was the first cell. At the beginning of everything, I was God, so there was just one cell, that was me. Then I emanated a male and female cell. So they're sort of on a lower level than me. So since you're wanting to be like God, then you can't mate with each other. But since I'm God, and if I mate, it's kind of like it starts from a higher level and goes downward. So I'm okay. It's okay for me to do it, but it's not okay for you to do it.
This reminds me of that conversation you and I had a while back about, you pointed out some very insightful aspects to the early progenitors of Darwinian theory, that the original singular cell was in some way feminine, and this sounds like kind of like a reversal of that I'm sort of some avatar of the original reproductive form, so therefore I have my say-so in all this.
Yes, and it's very Darwinian.
Right.
I'd say all so-called new religious movements, which we're looking at mid 19th century to the present. So Mormonism, everything that came after, new religious movements. Each one I've studied somehow integrates this idea of evolution as progress. So whereas you may look at neo-Darwinian theory and it will say, well, things become more complex, but that's not necessarily progress.
Mm-hmm.
Just like a computer program becomes more encumbered with zeros and ones, that's all that it is. However, you and I and everyone out there, if they're honest with themselves, will realize that what's lying below that is the kind of Lamarckian idea of everything's progressing.
Yes.
Whether, I mean, you can call it what you want, but it's the attempt to say, well, things are getting better, but I don't mean better. You know.
That's a great, exactly. And that's the point I always make is that progress is a presupposition based on some determinate fixed point which you can measure it. So it assumes some sort of scale by which to say this is devolution, this is progress, and on strictly naturalistic grounds, there's not really any basis beyond subjective assertion as to what constitutes something progressing as opposed to not progressing.
And we
No,
all
in
know,
other words, one is just so what if there's more information, more molecules that you're calling complexity? Well, on what grounds is that a progress against maybe less is more? Maybe simplicity is progress. You know what I mean? It's just arbitrary, is what I'm saying.
oh sure, and it's all already there in the kind of the pagan religious paradigm,
Yeah,
which
right,
contains both impulses. You know, the idea that we have to kind of flow out and reach completion of a historical cycle.
mm-hmm,
So, you know, going out and doing my own thing is a good thing because in the bigger scheme of things, it's going to bring things to completion. It's going to bring the last yuga forward so that we can
right.
bring the cycle over. Also, it may be the great thing to do to die in combat because you know it may just be the perfect expression of some kind of abstract principle.
Yeah, or is it to get back to the one and achieve complete negation and simplicity and dissolution of the ego into the thusness, into the absolute? So either way, it's just a pseudo intellectual, pseudo scientific version of the dialectic where there's no reason to prefer extreme complexity and multiplicity over extreme simplicity and negation of the self. There's not, neither of these options really is inherently more sensible than the other. It is, I mean, why either one? I mean, it doesn't make any sense
And that's
on those grounds.
yeah, that's the flexibility of it, so that
Yeah.
whenever you have, do we kill King Charles the First, or are we in favor of Parliament? Are we in favor of
Yes.
capitalism?
Right.
Are we in favor of mercantilism? There are. It's easy to come up with a list of supposedly divinely sanctioned reasons for following these, or maybe a secular ideology is the ground. Natural rights. So hey,
Mm-hmm.
we all know for a fact that the only thing we're in control of is our own body, as John Locke said. So let's mingle
Exactly.
our body with the material world through labor. And Marx got all of his thinking right out of that kind of
Oh,
thing.
I
And
know.
then also libertarianism gets its ideas. So
Exactly.
they
Right.
both kind of go back to the same. Who says that we own our own bodies?
Yeah, it's
That's just an assumption.
all the social contract, all the natural rights theory is based on an anthropology that's never questioned.
Sure. And I mean, think about it. You can do whatever you want with your own body. I mean, look at how that is in the news now. you know as a 3-year-old child, I can choose what gender I want to be.
Right.
So Locke has what we think about, what we say, and try to give it this stamp of, well, we're not talking religion anymore, we're just talking about what we know for to be a fact. That's a very dangerous ground, because
Absolutely.
then once you start with one axiom, then you don't have any way of stopping all these other
All the
ideas.
other things that flow from it, what we call epistemic self-consciousness. So let's bring this back to Jones. So Jones is looks like engaging in the cafeteria approach, maybe a dab of this on the plate, a dab of that on the plate, and we've got this Father Divine situation. So when we were having the technical difficulties, did I catch you saying that he wanted to basically take over this move of this cult?
Sure. When Father Divine died, Jones saw the opportunity. He got his buses together, his bus loads of his People's Temple members. They went to the headquarters of the Father Divine's Peace Mission, where his mother Divine was there. And he said, well, I'm the reincarnation of Father Divine, who's just died. So I'm going to be the head of this now, which meant that he would be mating with her. And she sort of said, "No, I don't really want to do it." She was a very elderly lady at that point.
It's like we're getting back to the P-Funk theology, Parliament P-Funk, the
Oh
mothership.
yeah,
So I
yeah,
mean, we were talking about that in relation to Nation of Islam, and we're kind of getting back to that with Jones even.
yeah. And Jones said, "Well, I'm here to stay. I'm the guy." And he's like, "I have all my people here in buses, and we're going to just sort of move into your housing facilities and all of that, and take over your financial infrastructure. It's mine now." And so she basically said, "No, I'm going to kindly invite you to get back in your buses, drive away, and never come back again." So when he got back and preached his next sermon at his own church, Jim Jones said, "Well, what really happened is she came on to me when we had that private conference, and I said, no, I'm not going to get it. I'm not going to have it that way." And so it was just his prowess, and that she couldn't resist, but he just wasn't going to stoop down to that level. That was his story. But anyway, the whole point was he saw himself as taking over this kind of, I guess you could say, this sort of Gnostic idea of I am God, incarnate, and it's all based on some kind of weird idea that let's look into the cellular structure of material reality, which is also divine reality.
Jim Jones moving in on that territory, taking over.
Trying to, and then he got told to leave, basically. And then, so I think the main point there is the fact that Jim Jones early on saw himself as a continuation of the black, new religious movements tradition, which
Yeah,
had already been there and had already integrated theosophical and new thought type ideas. In other words, neo-Gnostic ideas
right.
into the religious purview. But another thing that not very many people know that Jim Jones did before he ever went to California is that he went to Chicago to the headquarters of the Nation of Islam and wanted an audience with Elijah Muhammad, because apparently Jim
Wow.
Jones, at least at some point in his life, concocted the belief that he had a black soul. He said that his mother, Lynetta, had contact with a higher vibration from a different planet, which allowed a black soul to come into the body of a white child.
Well,
He
now
said
we can come up with a crazy conspiracy theory that Rachel Dolezal is actually the illegitimate daughter of Jim Jones.
that, and that's why he called himself Raven. He said, well, he said that Lynetta, my mother, got a child with black hair, black eyes, and a black soul. He said Raven, black hair. And his mother would write poems about him saying, he's got almost a divine nature. He's the raven. And she would end these poems with the word nevermore.
Here we are back to this, what we talked about last time, this strange fixation on color.
Mm-hmm.
I don't mean to make light of color. Obviously, color is very important in arts and life. Color is part of everyone's visual spectrum, I guess, unless you're colorblind. But yeah, here we go with that cult fixation on color.
Sure, it's the visual, because if you can say, hey, look at this image and this tells the story, then, you know, you can say, well, it goes beyond words, but let me give you words to explicate it. And you'll always have to go back to my idea of it. Also, you can use words to reach people's erotic feelings.
Yes.
And
Now,
so, you know,
right now, I've read. I don't know how accurate this is, but I've read that he visited Cuba, and there might be some sort of handler in the background, possibly, which would play into him moving into these different black movements. Because as I understand, he was also involved in other black organizations related to social betterment type stuff.
oh yeah, he had he was never when he tried to get in when he tried to have the meeting with the Nation of Islam, they didn't. He just was left waiting in the lobby. The whole idea seemed to be like, what's this white man doing trying to meet with me? We have nothing to say to one another. So he left kind of, in a huff over that. But he went to Cuba. He also went to. We don't have any definite information about a handler, but we do know that he claims that he saw the people of Cuba being not abused, but being opposed and oppressed by their own country and also the United States. He later, what a lot of people don't know is that he went to Brazil before he ever went to Guyana. He while he was in Indiana, he said, I'm going to go down to find a place where we can set up a communist socialist utopia. And so he went to Belo Horizonte, Brazil, and there he attended spiritualist meetings, because I don't know if the listeners
Yes.
know, but Brazil is the least Christian of any of those areas that have metropolitan areas in contact with, you know, the outside
Yeah, right.
world.
Well, and what I've read is that the thesis was that this was a cover. So he was supposedly there for establishing orphanages, but he might have actually been doing something else.
Yeah, it's plausible, but we just don't know. What the evidence that we do know seems to indicate that he went there. He attended some spiritualist meetings, because
Right.
Brazil has always been. In fact, one thing about Brazil is that the so-called spiritualism of Allan Kardec was the only person who actually made an institutional religion out of 19th century spiritualism. The only nation that has a sizable number of Kardecian spiritualists is Brazil. And in Rio de Janeiro, the birthplace of Bossa Nova, and by the way, where Bossa Nova was began in the house of a priestess. This is no joke. Look up Bossa Nova on Wikipedia. There was a priestess who was a practitioner of this traditional Brazilian slave religion type stuff. That's where the original composers in the 40s and 50s and even before that composed some of the classic bossa nova tunes did it in the presence of a priestess as a kind of school, musical school. And so anyway, Jim Jones was in Belo Horizonte, Brazil. They have their own spiritualist meetings, which are very syncretistic. They blend together all kinds of different religious ideas, and he attended them. I presume trying to get his finger on the pulse of what makes people tick in this nation, and I'm going to try to use their religious longings in order to bind them to my organization. Now, whether he was put up to it by some world government. Well, one thing we do know is when he went to Jonestown, he established contact with the Soviet embassy in Georgetown, Guyana,
Hmm.
and they even had Timofeyev, some kind of Russian diplomat, visited Jonestown, and he tried to make all these old black ladies learn phrases from Russian. He had it on loudspeakers going day in, day out. Learn these phrases, and with very little success, I guess, because he was very disappointed at people's inability to pronounce Russian words.
Hmm.
But yeah, there's definitely. Here's the thing I will say: there are world governments that are involved
Right.
in Jonestown. As far as the conspiracy theories, maybe, but I focus more on the psychobiographical side of it,
Right.
which leads more into the new religious movements and also the Gnostic basis of it.
Right. Now, and I do want to keep down that road, but I would like to add that I've read that there are some interesting connections with World Vision, which is notably CIA front, just like many other aid organizations like U.S. Aid. And there are some interesting connections with the Office of Naval Intelligence in regard to what Jones is up to. Again, I'm not saying that these are definitive proofs. Just these
Right.
are interesting tie-ins and connections that other authors have posited in relation to Jonestown.
Oh, and sure, and another tidbit that has to do with the world governments type angle is that the Guyanese government, which was headed by, I can't remember the guy's name, Burnham. Uh, his name is Burnham. I can't remember the full name, but
Yes.
this fellow, Burnham Forbes, he actually gave Jonestown, or Jim Jones and People's Temple, the lease on
Okay.
the acreage, which was on the border of Guyana and Venezuela, I believe. They had other groups were out there too. Other religious groups were along that border, and many commentators, including Tim Reitman, who wrote Raven, the story of Jim Jones and People's Temple, and he was at Jonestown while the massacre took place too, and got out alive. But um, these people have said, look, there is an obvious pattern here of the Guyanese government wanting to take these American religious groups. There was a Jewish group out there too. Put them along this border so that Venezuela will not try to cross the border, not try to annex territory. They'll be afraid to injure and kill an American because can you imagine the backlash? You know, if an American is seen to be, impinged upon or tortured or killed by a Venezuelan. So there was kind of definitely some international machinations were at play.
Yeah, now, on the subject that you just discussed, one of the books I have, it says Jones was there in Brazil to study the phenomena of David Miranda, a Pentecostalist minister who had started his own congregation, the Church of God is Love, in Brazil, 1960 to 61. Shortly before Jones's arrival, Miranda's mix of Christian fundamentalist Pentecostalism with faith healing was accused in 1999 of money laundering, which would have attracted the like-minded Jones. And he gets into Macumba, Umbanda, Candomblé, these different popular spiritualist movements, and that's exactly what you're talking about. And this would appeal then, as Jones learns these techniques, to the demographic that Jones will later try to manipulate.
Yes, and if we move things forward, that's right on cue, because we move things forward to California in the 60s when Jones moved his whole operation to California, first Ukiah and then to San Francisco and Los Angeles. And at this point, he's got a lot more power. He begins to just like the Nation of Islam in Chicago, he gets into city politics in San Francisco, because people like George Moscone, who became the mayor of San Francisco, who was later assassinated, he became an ally of Jones because Jones is like, well, if you need people to vote for you, I'll bring People's Temple's members from all over the place, and they'll vote in your district. In other words, we'll do an illegal, moving of voters into your area just on voting day, and you'll have these block votes. He's like, because I can tell people what to vote. And so he became involved in city politics, and that's when finally the news story broke that, well, here's 4 or 5 different people that have left the People's Temple, and there's some really bad things going on in there. And it's in the wake of that article, the next day, this is November 1978, after this article broke in the news, that Jim Jones said, we're leaving and going to Guyana, which he had already set up Jonestown in Guyana as, well, this is the People's Temple Agricultural Project, this is going to be our utopia. But his actual decision to leave and stay there permanently until his death, November 18th, 1978, that came because he was going to get this bad press. And what did the bad press say? He's sexually abusing people. He was having people get up in front of the put on boxing gloves and fight. He would get someone bigger than you, and he would say, go ahead and fight each other. And the disturbing thing is that this continued in Jonestown. You can listen to a YouTube video, which is really just an audio, which has a woman who has to fight. He's like, well, what are we going to do with this woman? And he has these old women come up and start hitting her. It's really terrifying.
So the Andy Kaufman approach to religion.
Absolutely, and it's funny, but it's also horrific, because this person is terrified, and they're having other people come up and just flog them.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard not to laugh though, because this is just so bizarre.
Oh yeah. Trust me, it's weird, and Jones would start tittering. He would start laughing, this hyena type laugh, and he would only do that when people would start hitting other people. And he would say, wow, these seniors, he's like, our security can't even hold these seniors back. They're in their 70s and they can hold their own, stuff like that.
So here's a question I have at this point, and probably some other listeners have this same question. I don't want to get off track. I want to stay where we are. But in your opinion, is he just completely insane, or is he just a complete psychopath who's actually intelligent, or is he just a complete basket case?
No, I think that just in the same way that one of my favorite book on Hitler, Hitler's Philosoph, says, look, we don't get anywhere by saying Hitler's insane. If we look at Hitler as a person who's this is Lawrence Berken's book, Hitler's Philosoph, in which he said we need to look at Hitler as a product of Western civilization and as someone who represented and elaborated several themes that come out of Western civilization.
Mm-hmm.
So he's not alien to the Western, development. Likewise, I think Jim Jones. Maybe I should write a book called Jim Jones's Philosoph, because I think that he doesn't come up with his ideas out of nowhere.
Yeah.
And I don't think that he's insane, because an insane person, is a person who, I'm no expert on these matters, but I would think that a person who, it depends on what you mean by insane.
Well, what I meant was, is he a dupe who's being used by other entities, or is he more clever than that and just a sadistic, cult leader who's actually pretty intelligent?
Well, I think he was very intelligent. I think that the way I've sort of looked at it in my research is, I've said that he had a death wish from early on, because when he lay on his bed and had a beam of consciousness of light that burst out of the darkness, and think here about the NOI cosmology, where you have the black womb that the white semen, bindu of semen, rotates out of. He's laying there and he gets the beam of consciousness, maybe a lightning flash. We think back to Luther's, storms, thunderstorm.
Yeah, Joseph Smith's vision of Moroni out in the middle of Missouri or wherever.
Yeah, the burned over district in New York. Yeah, or what? Do you have them? Yeah, that was in the mountains of New York. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So I mean, you may have had another one later, but nonetheless, the point is that this idea that the natural world and its forces are revealing to me, the inner workings of the divine, and the fact that Jim Jones as a child said, "Why am I an outsider? Why is my mommy and daddy not around? They never go to school functions. I'm alone. I'm, less fortunate. We're hungry here in this house." So I think that the the answer that he felt that he got was that God is within him, a splinter of divine essence is within him, and that if he can lead others to the same raised consciousness, then there will be no inequality, there will be no outcasts, and all things will be equal. So I think that what he found in socialism was a cure for the inadequacies of his upbringing and the nurturing that he didn't get.
Yes.
And then also, so I do think that it started from a personal thing, but I think later in life, when he got into the Father Divine stuff, he started realizing that, well, how do you deal with the sexual vector? How do you deal with sexuality? And I think the way he dealt with it is pretty shocking, and most people aren't aware of it. But by the time he got to California, he was basically having sex with men and women, and young men and women.
Oh, so he was bisexual. Okay.
Oh yeah, and basically, what happened was he started having sex with pretty much anybody he could, and he said what he did was he justified it by stratifying sexual activity, I think, into at least 3, possibly 4 different layers. He said the lowest level of sexuality is conventional heterosexual family relationships. He said those are just conventional bourgeois, lies. And he said it's all connected to property, and this is mine and not yours, that kind of thing, traditional families. So he would berate people and say, you don't need to give your allegiance to your earthly father. You need to give it to me. You don't need to be so hung up on your marriage to your husband. You need to be with me. But he said that the layer above conventional heterosexuality was active homosexuality. He said, you're all homosexuals, and I'm the only heterosexual in the world. So he said that people in the temple who were honest about their homosexual desires and acted on them with other temple members were above the lowest level. And he said, however, that's only a sort of plateau that you have to rise above, because he said the even higher level is the asexual or the celibate level.
Yeah, it reminds me of what's the Crowley statement that the eye of Horus is far superior to the mouth of Isis, as that is the butthole is superior to the vagina.
Oh yeah, and he said what he would quote Romans, I think 1:12, which says, "Give your whole body as an offering to God." And yeah, Jim Jones said that means to give up your penis, give up your vagina, and even your asshole if need be.
Now, what's funny that many times that we've had conversations, you've always made me chuckle with the way that you've pointed out the various biblical texts that have been seized upon by weirdos and cult leaders. They get so creative in their exegesis, right? Where there's like, give your whole body. Ah, yes.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
then, as you said earlier with the Parliament song, put your whole body on any part of your body that ails you, even your genitalia, I'm assuming, and even your backside on
Another
video, and it'll be healed by the vibrations, presumably.
reminds me of another cult that did the same technique. David Masha Moser, I forget what exact the guy's name, but the Children of God cult out in California that formed
Mhm.
out of the remnants of the Jesus people movement of the 60s and 70s. The Children of God cult was also a pedo situation where uh, David, what's his face, whatever the leader's name is, he would have all those tracks drawn up. Have you seen those tracks before?
No.
Yeah, you got to see this. He came up with this idea called flirty fishing. And what this was that you needed to actually be a prostitute to convert people.
Right.
And so he would actually have X-rated little comic books drawn up, maybe in the vein of chick tracks,
Hmm.
but they're all sexual.
Right.
And he would do that. He would take certain verses out and give them this innuendo meaning, which they obviously didn't have. But yeah, the Children of God cult is very fascinating, and a lot of there's some interesting Hollywood characters that unfortunately come out of that. The Phoenix family, in fact, River Phoenix's parents were at one time wrapped up in that cult.
That's too bad, and we all know about his troubled,
Hmm.
trajectory of his life too.
Yeah. I think Rose McGowan was unfortunately a part of that cult when she was young. So, yeah, a really nasty group. And I'm not talking about the children that were involved in it. I'm talking about these sickos that ran it. Um, uh, and some have speculated, I don't know how accurate it is, but the Rivers' death may have been a result of some connection to that cult because he gave an interview to, I think, Variety magazine or Rolling Stone, one of the big magazines, prior to his death, that discussed the nefarious workings of that cult. But this was prior to, I think, a lot of the bad press coming out about that cult.
Very fascinating and just tragic. But it's just far too common, and especially in the Hollywood Babylon, right? I mean, that's what goes on there. So anyway, also, so the asexual celibate level, it's the third level above the conventional heterosexual and then the active homosexual. But the weird thing is, as you probably saw this coming from a mile away, since only Jim Jones is at the real asexual celibate level, he can berate those who are in traditional marriages, and he can also berate the homosexuals because they're not at the level
Hmm.
he's at.
By
And
the
they,
way, I apologize. David Berg is who I was thinking of. He was the pedo cult leader there. But go ahead.
yes, David Berg. I'm definitely going to look that up
Yeah,
and see if
look up
that.
the Family International, and this is all completely right up your road in terms of this kind of research.
Right. And so what Jim Jones would do is he would say, if you're on the lowest level, if you're a very masculine man, can you still hear me?
Yes, keep going.
Oh, okay. I heard a little.
I was just sending you that link, but go ahead. I didn't mean to
Oh,
distract you. Go ahead. So
no
you're
problem.
homosexual. Lowest level is the hetero, right?
Yeah, and he would say to raise you up to the higher level of active homosexual, then you need to have intercourse with me, and he would always take the dominant
Mm.
role.
Oh.
Uh, Yeah, he said the first time he had sex with a man, he threw up on the man's back, but it was so necessary to the cause that he continued with it somehow. And he would say but if you've already been risen up to the level of active homosexual, he said you're not at the highest level there either. So if he saw anyone showing affection to the same sex, he would berate them for being selfish and not being the asexual celibate version, which he said only he was, ironically. Um, Now, he said some of the temple members started getting on to Jim Jones and saying, well, if everything's supposed to be shared equally, why do you only have sex with white women with brown hair and small breasts? And then also men, and also very handsome, kind of androgynous men. And he said, well, and of course he was probably just shifting his rhetoric to deflect attention away from the fact that he was just being a lech. But he said, well, he said, sex is essentially a hostile act. He said, and since I only perpetrated on whites, he said, if anything, I'm prejudiced against whites. So he was able, at least in
The
his mind.
twists of logic for cult leader reasoning
Oh
are
yeah, what he's doing is
stupendous.
he's just saying, here's these binaries of male, female, white, black, child, father, heterosexual, homosexual, and I'm the master of all these because I'm the apeiron, which contains all the antipodes, all the
Yeah,
opposites.
I'm beyond all dualities. I'm the Ubermensch. I'm the great one. Okay.
So if if I mingle, if you'll pardon the expression, if I mingle with anyone else's essence, it's to their betterment because I'm the direct line to the whole, to the, pun intended.
Now
Uh,
this doesn't come up a lot in the treatments of the cult, which is I've read more stuff about the cult itself, but this is great because this is a whole side of this where a lot of times we're not looking at the guy himself.
Exactly. And I wanted to read you a quotation from Lori Ephron Calahas, who this is cited in the Bellefontaine book, A Lavender Look at the Temple. And this was a book, kind of a self published ebook by a guy. He's actually passed away, Bellefontaine. He was a member of I think he was either a member of the People's Temple or he was just a person who knew people who were. But he's looking at the People's Temple from a gay perspective, and he quotes this lady as saying, the protection Jim Jones opted for psychologically was the conviction that he was always the giver and others the takers, obviously disempowering to the taker who can never freely love but must remain a dependent child. I would finally surmise that everyone needs a father, and people need a father more than they need sex. Have more to do, that those are quotations from Jim Jones, by the way, have more to do with his relating across sexual lines than any inherent homosexuality in either him or most of the men. The model wasn't man woman, it was parent child. Jim said people didn't really want sex anyway, they want a father. So what was this? Mass incest? I could never ever ask. No
So,
one could.
wow, that's crazy. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I
Oh
just
no, that's the end of the
okay.
quotation.
So we're talking like George. I just went blank. Who's the big pop singer? Uh,
Oh,
George
George,
Michael. I will be your father figure. Put your tiny hands in mine.
yeah, whose real name is like uh, Georgios Michailopoulos or something like
Yeah,
that.
right. So because that song, I've always got the impression that even though the video is him and a supermodel, the lyrics are a little more homoerotic between guy and young guy is
And
kind
I
of
might be totally wrong about this, but I think the Asiatic-looking quote unquote woman in the father figure video, I heard that she was a transvestite
oh
or a
really.
transsexual. I might be completely off base with that. Definitely double check that. But it's interesting that later he just kind of threw up in his hands and said, I'm obviously a homosexual. Of course, after he, was caught in the men's restroom. And that's another thing is that Jim Jones in the 60s was caught
Mm.
in a restroom with his penis erect and walking up to a undercover cop and walked up to him provocatively with his erect penis, you know, there. And the cop arrested him. And these records that he had, lewd conduct was the charge, and these records were sealed by a California judge, probably because of Jim Jones's clout. But at that point, Jim Jones was really shaken by this, and he said to Carolyn Layton, one of his main uh, sexual mates in the group, he said, "No more sex with outsiders."
Mm.
So that meant sex with insiders only. But he lived with this kind of idea that, well, I am doing these sexual acts with all different kinds of people, different ages, different genders, but it's all just to further them along the path of enlightenment. But he wasn't able to jive that with just going into a men's room and propositioning someone randomly. But that's what he actually did. Another thing he did, he had a follower, the David Wise gentleman that I was talking about before. He was a preacher who was one of Jim's advisors, and he said he came into Jim's chambers one time, and Jim Jones was laying on the bed with a long T-shirt on only, much like Wise describes it as a kind of shirt like a woman would wear to bed, as pajamas. He said, but he had his erect penis was visible. He pulled the shirt up and showed it, which was riven with herpes sores.
Ew.
And yeah, I'm very sorry to go into this, but he said that Jim Jones said the herpes sores are closed right now, so it would be okay if you suck it. And
I never would have thought James Kelley would be the guy to take Jay's analysis into Howard Stern land.
Hey, I'm kidding.
I don't care. But by the way, I would like to add real quick, and this is a little neat side bit here. I looked up the woman in the video with George Michael. Her name is Tanya Harcourt Coos, and she's actually the daughter of minor nobility in England. So she's got kids. So I would that's a safe bet that she is an actual female. So
yeah, I might have gotten my information from like ninth grade schoolyard rumors about popular music. Along the lines of Metallica and Guns N' Roses had a fight. So I wouldn't really quote me as a source.
You never know who's going to listen to this, so I don't want to, get somebody pissed who's actually a female and not at one time a male.
Oh, absolutely. We don't want to slander anyone here. But back to the guy with the chancre-ridden member. Yeah, Jim Jones said you can go ahead and suck it, and the Mr. Wise said it'd be better if you use your hand. He goes, that's what I do when I have the urge. And Jim Jones said, well, what do you visualize when you do that? And this Wise person said, nothing. And Jim Jones was very taken aback by this. And he said, really, you don't have any kind of fantasy in your mind at all? And he said, no, I don't think of anything. And so Jim Jones said, you're a great teacher. You're a great man of God and all this stuff. And he just couldn't get over it. That and later on, another person said that Jim Jones said that while you're having sex with another temple member to try to get them to a higher level, he said you should only be thinking about divine socialism while you're doing this. If you're thinking about your own lust or anything, then it just ruins the whole kind of Crowley-esque. I'm putting Crowley-esque in there myself. There's no evidence that he had any connection to Western sexual magic. Mm-hmm. But I think it's just more of a generalized weird thing that he combined the sexuality and said, it matters what you visualize, at the moment of completion of the act. And you have to be visualizing divine socialism, whatever that is. So all of this stuff is a different picture. Like you said, you don't really get this on the PBS documentary much. You do get some of it, though.
Yeah.
But, yeah, he definitely, you asked the question before, is he simply crazy? Well, I think that, I don't know how to answer that other than saying he looked at the storehouse of different Western ideas and religious, ideas, and he kind of wove them into his own version of, he would say he doesn't believe in God, but he would say there's a God within. Or
yeah, that's what I was going to bring up, was the apparent atheism of the eventual, I guess you could call it theology, I don't know what to call it, more of a social gospel of the People's Temple. I read some accounts of former members of the temple at academic websites, and the accounts of the former members said that, we didn't really have a theology, so it's almost not even accurate to talk about People's Temple theology, because it was all gods and no gods, really. It was more just a social justice type thing.
Sure, and it's hard to know, especially, I'll give you an example, since you like the biblical exegesis part of it. He actually said, well, let's take the Genesis story. He said, what do we have? He said, we have a sky god who, first he said, here's what in the beginning was. He said, basically, there was nothing but a sky god. And here I think he's not saying that he believes this. He's saying this is what the Bible puts forth and this is false. He says, basically, there's a sky god and all he could do was fart. So he farted out stars and planets all over the place. He said, however, he was afraid of creating another god like himself, which he had the power to do. So he could have created, another divine person. He could have created a trinity, but he was afraid that that god would also fart stars and planets, and those might hurt him.
Could have been Origin with gas.
Yes, it's all about the alimentary canal.
That was that was an obscure reference that because Origin said the second person's created. So, but yeah, right. So we're still focused on the butt region here.
Oh yeah, the In Through the Outdoor, as the Led Zeppelin album was entitled. And so he says that's how things were created. But he said that the divine was the divine being. He said was lonely. There was no mama god. It was just a daddy. So what he did was he wanted to create beings that were lower than him, that were created out of the lowest parts of him, so he could control them. So he said he had these controlled farts that he emitted, and that these were, he said, the little dingies is what he called them, which are us. He said the dirty planets, he said, which were just little old pieces of shit, is what Jim Jones called planets. And so Earth is a little old piece of shit. And he said, so the little dingies,
now,
he said...
Is this tongue-in-cheek? I mean, is he saying this tongue-in-cheek? I mean, come on.
I have no earthly idea. But he said that all these little dingies could do is tickle God's toes. He said, or when he said do this, they say yassa. That's what he said the dingies do. So he said, or have them sing hosannas to me for all eternity, which he said was the most boring thing you could think of doing. He said, however, something happened that this sky god didn't intend on. He emitted a loose fart, and he said that's what Lucifer is. It's a kind of a the actual etymology would be loose fart was the original word, but they shortened it to Lucifer.
You know what? I joke about morning zoo radio, which is that annoying trend of when you're in a big city and you turn on the radio at 8 a.m, and it's the morning shock jocks, and they do what's called zoo radio, and they're it's Bob and Tom in the morning, and then there's a bunch of toilet flushes and fart sounds, and everyone's constantly laughing. And here James Kelley has turned Jay's analysis into morning zoo radio, but with the most high-minded, ridiculous, obscure, arcane topics.
Yeah, because it's Gnostic in origin, right? So,
yeah. And that's what Gnostics do. Is that what they do? Is they say, look, you want to have all this high-minded, esoteric concept of this world and all that, but you ignore the dirty side of this world, shit and fucking and all this kind of stuff. And that's what goes on in this world, and all that stuff is beastly and lowly, so therefore this whole realm has to just be the bad gas of a sky god.
Yeah, and he even said it. He said basically, he goes, the sky god wants us down here, down on the ground, sniffing his shit. He said, but what Lucifer, what he actually was able to do, since he had some of the higher elements of the sky god were accidentally included in his being. So he was able to go around and make his own farts. That's what Jim Jones said. And he said, and that's what we can become if we have a raised consciousness, is we can quit being the dingies that just say yessa, yessa, anytime the master cracks the whip. Instead...
This is the most awesome radio interview of all time. I'm not kidding.
Yeah, there's going to be some sound bites that are taken out of this thing that are going to be really misconstrued. I can tell that already.
I may have to put this whole thing up as I was going to do it half and half, part for pay subscriber, but this is too awesome not to have all out there. This is great. So I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm going to quit interrupting. This is too good.
No. It's a kind of discourse that begs to be interrupted. But he said that's basically what we can do. And that's the goal, is to raise your consciousness to the point that you realize that this whole idea, this whole sky god that creates beings that are lesser than him, that are tied to materiality, the pile of shit planet that we're on, that kind of thing. He said that can be transcended from within by realizing that we cannot be the beings that don't have all the good aspects of divine, but we actually have all the aspects within us. But we have, through divine socialism, through bringing about this revolution, we can access all those higher elements. And he actually said, look, this is not theology. He said, but I do have a higher evolutionary status than everyone else because I have these paranormal abilities to sense other planets, to use my thought to do all. Remember the mothership where it could know your thoughts before you think them.
Mm-hmm.
It seems that the way to get past this whole theology science dichotomy in modernity for these new religious movements is to say, well, it's a higher evolution and it takes place in the thought realm.
And you're saying Jones actually says that he had some direct connect to this exotheology.
Sure, he would say it wasn't theology. He would say it's a higher
Okay.
it's a higher level of evolution on the psychic realm. He had paranormal abilities to heal people, he said, because he was more psychically evolved, and he was said everyone can get to that point.
Well, but I know he doesn't believe in theology, but what I'm saying is the term exotheology or astrotheology is one of these themes in these cults.
Yes.
Where the ideology derives in some way from the astral, that is the space realm that is out there in outer space. There's the mothership, there's the Hubbard, Xenu, etc.
And you have Mormonism. You have the idea that there can be a father god on each planet.
Every planet, right?
We would think, well, another planet is just right over in the next couple light years away, no problem, as far as another solar system or whatever. But I think it's funny that it has a link to scientism, which would say how can we start off cosmic dust and end up making the Mona Lisa? And he would say, they would say, well, there's just such a large amount of time that goes on that we can't comprehend it.
Yeah.
I think likewise, Jim Jones at one point said, you want to find the sky god? He goes, think about trillions of light years and think about projecting yourself out through the universe. He goes, you'll find nothing but just cold cosmic dust out there. And then in the other side of his mouth, he will say, yes, but I can get these vibrations from other planets where there are higher extraterrestrial beings there.
This is exactly what Hubbard claimed. Where he says he has that ridiculous number 600 trillion years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Xenu was doing his thing 600 100 trillion years ago.
Yes, and it's this whole idea that, well, yes, they're on D-28s carrying the souls all the way to Tigiak, or as we call it, Earth, so that they can be blown up in the volcanoes. Mm-hmm. But we have to realize that these D-28s didn't have turbine engines like we know. They were able to use some other kind of crazy technology.
Now, if you don't mind,
go fast.
And I'm not challenging you because I don't doubt what you're saying. Do you have a source on that? Because I don't think most people who think about Jonestown would make any kind of exotheology, astrotheology connect to Jones's claims.
Absolutely. I've got a book here, a very, very good book by David Chichester called Salvation and Suicide, subtitled Jim Jones, The People's Temple in Jonestown.
Excellent.
And on page, on page 82, I believe it is, it says here, this is Chichester. In another sermon in 1972, Jim Jones declared, quote, I come from another planet. Ezekiel's vision of a heavenly chariot was interpreted by Jones as a sighting of an extraterrestrial visitation. Also, Jones says there are other planets that are more highly evolved. I can get you there if you'll listen to me. That's on the FBI tape, which is cataloged as Q1035.
Wow. So, and this is really going to, again, in our series, this is going to come into play, especially when we get to Heaven's Gate. And I don't mean to get ahead of things, but again, I'm just highlighting common theme here, people.
Absolutely. And also, just one final note on the whole Lucifert regime. He says this is the funniest etymology I've ever heard, and it's totally incorrect. Is that he says that the word Adam in Greek originally meant shit, and he said so the lonely sky god created exactly what he was in himself, a lonely shit. So therefore Adam had to create a piece of side shit out of himself, which was woman.
Speaking of funk and P-Funk, I'm going to play the P-Funk song at the beginning of this interview because we've gotten really funky in two senses here.
Oh, yeah, and honestly, if you go to the Parliament lyrics, there is this idea of putting your nose. There's a Sir Nose devoid of funk.
Mm-hmm.
He's kind of the non-funky individual who won't. He can't stand to put his nose in the funk, which is what you have to do, right? Just like the Gnostic, Carpocratian Gnostics, which I'm not sure that what I'm doing is not Gnostic by starting from the shit and then, elevating it to kind of a higher level. But
I may just add
nonetheless,
in some toilet flushes like a shock jock. This is awesome.
I think I might need to go on. You and I need to much like Jim Jones went to the offices of the NOI. We need to go to the offices of Howard Stern. Need to
Yeah,
get
this is right up Howard's alley. He would love this talk.
especially since he's mellowed out a little bit and he tends to be a little bit more open to actual serious ideas now than he used to be.
Right.
But I think he got tired of the superficiality of what he used to do somewhat. But anyway,
Right.
uh,
So how about combine high-mindedness with the potty stuff? That's glowing radio, right? That's a hit right there.
why not? But yeah, and I think before we're done here, I think we should definitely deal with what everybody wants to know about, which is why are we talking about Jim Jones? Because over 900 people lost their lives
Exactly
in
right.
November 18th, 1978. So these ideas had consequences. And it's one of those things. It's just hard to comprehend. But it's not one. First thing I would like to say about it is it's not really a mass suicide. It is a mass suicide, but it's more accurately a mass murder suicide because over 300 of those who died were children who had no choice in the
Hmm.
matter. So they were murdered by the people who injected them with the cyanide solution. So when you look and see exactly what was going on at this point, uh, Jones says some pretty bizarre things at this point. He says, "Look," he says, I don't want to have sex anymore." He goes, "I'm done with this goddamn world, and I want that. I want you to share in that great orgasm, the one in the grave." He says. So he's always got this point of reference of
So it becomes a
my own bodily needs and the
yeah.
lack of fulfillment.
So it becomes a nihilistic leap into oblivion.
Yeah, because on one side, on certain there are tapes, the so-called death tape. It's recording right before people start. You can hear people screaming in the background that they're dying. So some people are very, like, well, you shouldn't have this on the internet, people losing their lives. But I think that it is a historical document. As long as it's treated with the gravity and respect that it deserves, then I think that there's nothing that says it can't be on there.
Now, what about the account, the Congress guy that was going to investigate it, that was supposed
Leo
to?
Ron.
Yeah. What about all that?
Well, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of people that have commented on Jonestown that have said, the reason why things came to a head that way on that day was because they demanded to be let into the People's Temple agricultural project, Jonestown. If they hadn't done that, then the people might still be alive. But I think that Jim Jones, it was going to go to that point sooner or later, because what people need to understand is months and even years before the November 18th, the day of the tragedy, he was rehearsing people for this. And when you got to Jonestown, he said everything would be a paradise, and when you got there, it was a labor camp. It was,
Right. It was like a mind control thing. Yeah.
yeah, there were people that lived there for years that said I only ate meat like once a year. So we're talking about European medieval conditions. It's almost like a neo-feudal uh,
Mm.
institution because Jones was in control of everything, the sexual lives of all the people there. If you were known to have sex, then he would bring the offenders in front of everyone else in the pavilion and make them do it in front of everyone, so that even children and elderly and everyone would watch the act. Um, so he controlled everything, and you worked from 5 in the morning till dark every single day with very little food. and no possessions, basically. And so as this progressed, he would start to say, "Yes, but we're besieged. You know, there are CIA operatives in the foliage right over the hill."
Right. I've heard that. Yeah.
And so he would start what he called the White Knights. He wanted to call them the Black Knights, but then he's like, "No," he said, "they're not. Black is something good, so therefore we'll call them White Knights." So that's where that expression comes from. He said the White Knights, yeah, because the incursions are the white power which we have to counter with our people's temple. So, and remember, 70% of the people there were black.
Yeah.
So,
Right. Yet another tie-in or similarity to Nation of Islam.
oh, absolutely. And like I said, I mean, let's not forget, he tried to become part of the Nation of Islam.
Right.
Perhaps it was another infiltration scheme, but we can't sit there and say, well, he tried to infiltrate, you know, Father Divine, and he tried to infiltrate NOI, so he didn't believe in their teachings. That's not necessarily something we can assume. You can believe in the teaching of a group and say, I'm going to infiltrate you and take you over and expand on your teaching.
That's a good point. Yeah, he may have just continuously flip-flopped through a bunch of different worldviews.
And since it all was the sanction for it all came from within, from his own consciousness of his link to infinite spirit is his father, is one thing he said. So I mean, he could always look at you know, whatever the means were and say, well, the end is always this, you know, highest gnosis. But anyway, the White Knights were the White Knights would gather, and he would enter into these long raving monologues about how if you're really dedicated to this, then you have to lay down your life, because all the prophets of old laid down their life. They let no man take it from us. They're going to come in here. We can do nothing about it. So therefore we need to be able to lay down our life. And then they would start passing out the Kool-Aid. Now, it wouldn't be poisoned at this point, but everyone had to drink it. And he would go back to your huts and lay down, and you'll be dead in 45 minutes. And he would say, what he said on November 18th is, he said, like the Greeks in the old days, you know, drink the potion and enter into a new plane. Step over peacefully, you know. So he did believe in reincarnation, but like you said, the nihilism theme, he tended to flip-flop between saying, yes, maybe next incarnation we'll go. The last thoughts of Jim Jones,
Okay.
and what he thought the whole death meant. On the night of November 18th, the night of the tragedy, Jones said to all the gathered People's Temple members at the pavilion, he said, I live with death every goddamn day. You can't live with life unless you live with death. He said, I will die for the communist collective, and I will die for principle. He also said, the only fuck I want right now is the orgasm of the great fuck in the grave. And the thing that's really disturbing about all this is the question of scholars that have posed the question, did these people do it willingly or did they not? And I think the question is kind of moot in a way, because all the White Knights that preceded the last night, it was all conditioning people to say, look, yes, we are really doing this thing. Yes, we are really raising ourselves to the higher consciousness. We are creating this utopia. Even though every minute of your life is misery, everything we're doing is bringing about perfect bliss. Oh, here's the cocktail. Drink this to show that you are really dedicated to it. Then go and you'll die. Well, and then they never die. That happens night after night, after day, when any dissent to that ritual would be punished physically. So there's one person who survived that later said, finally, I didn't really care whether it was real or not. So I think at the end, yes, people walked right up there. Some people resisted. Most people just, you know, drank it. Why? Because they were conditioned to do so. I don't think it's because they're just mindless morons. You know, we weren't there and we don't know what it's like. And we might have, you know, wished our own demise after undergoing all that torment ourselves. So so that's kind of a sobering end to.
Yeah. So a testament almost to the ability of the wicked, I guess, to condition, to socially engineer in a kind of test tube the worst possible outcome.
Absolutely. And there has never been anything like this happen. Over 900 people commit suicide. There have been mass suicides in history, but never one that we can look at where one person in their
Hmm.
peculiar ideas and their peculiar organization of their religious beliefs led to this outcome by a kind of mass ritual. So the fact that there's the sexual component, there's the Gnostic component. I'm a redeemer who's going to redeem you from this sky god who just wants us to sit around
Hmm.
being, you know, embodying the lower controllable forms of his essence. This is a very good test case. It's more representative, like you said, of all the other new religious movements than I think most people realize.
Recognize, yeah. There's a definite pattern here, and that's what I think so genius about what you're doing here in this work is pointing that out. Um, so there we go. Just one of the darkest, most bizarre things you could look at, Jonestown. What? One last question, James. Where do you put this in our in our day, in our era? What does this represent in a cultural, world historical sense?
Well, what it represents for me is the fact that whenever we look at a religious movement, or a new religious movement, of course, we can't just look at one factor and say, well, is this person crazy or sane? I think that there are historical, ideological, and political factors that go into it, and it's usually not just uh, one factor. It's something that's a confluence of different factors
Right.
that influence the outcome. And it's always there's always something that we're not answering. There's always something out there that we're guessing at,
Mm-hmm.
but we see certain patterns and we can just say. And another thing I would say is most of the books I've read, when it comes time to say, "Oh my gosh, this is horrible," they don't do that because a lot of them are academics who can't say that because they have absolutely no sanction to say this is right and this is wrong. So you read books like you read books like Chichester, who it's one of the better books about religion I've read in a long time. But the person is like, well, we don't want to be too narrow-minded here. It's that kind of mentality that we can't call, evil evil. Uh, but then again, we could look on the other side of that question and see, when there's. I remember looking at a news item where there was this pyramid scheme guy or this Ponzi scheme guy, and there was this Jewish banker out there that said he was crying, and he said, "It's not that he's evil. It's just that or he said it's not about the money. He said it's just being in the presence of someone so evil."
Mm.
And the whole idea is, oh yeah, well, I mean, are you coming at this from theology? Because otherwise, there really isn't anything that's evil. There's just what you prefer and what you don't prefer.
Just subjective preferences. Total relativism gives no grounds for commenting either way. It's just what is, right?
And then I think Raskolnikov in Dostoevsky's
I was
Punishment,
exactly about to say Crime and Punishment. You read my mind.
and I guess that's the best final word right there is Raskolnikov. If there is no God, all is permissible.
Right. Wow. Another thing too that I think of when I think about this incident is my friend who wrote a piece, Rainbow Temple. I forget the exact title of it, but it's at Jay's Analysis, and he makes the point that when we have these bizarre ideologies of something like absolutely enforced equality, when it really isn't equality in the world, but when ideologues and power structures attempt to enforce absolute across the board in every sense equality, what ends up happening is disaster, right? So if we think about communist ideologues trying to enforce mass radical equalitarianism and egalitarianism, what ends up being the result? Well, masses get blamed for why things aren't equal, and you get 10, 20, 60 million dead, like Mao, situations like that. So I see it as another example of adopting an ideology and attempting to enforce it on a reality out there in the world, a metaphysic that doesn't match up to it. And what's the end result? Well, it ends up in mass death.
Absolutely. I'm in agreement with that 100%. It's a perfect example of that.
Well, so that concludes Jonestown. And did you say that next up we want to do Scientology?
Yeah, we'll do Scientology next. I would love to have years to go over every single document that has anything to do with Scientology, but of course, this will force me to just read the stuff that I can get in there in the
Hmm.
next 2 or 3 weeks and then have a presentation. So it's a good thing that I'm having these deadlines. So
All right, well, awesome. And I'm like I said, I'm going to make this whole lecture public. So James, tell us again for new listeners, there will be new people coming across this who are not familiar with you. Tell us about your work, where they can find you, where they can get your books.
yeah, I have the one book that's in print right now is Anatomizing Divinity. It's sort of my history of Western esotericism, magic, alchemy, all of the rejected religious knowledge that constitutes a big part of what the Western tradition really is. That's what that book covers. That's probably the best thing to buy if you're going to buy something of mine. So that you can get on Amazon.com is the best place. Anatomizing Divinity. James L. Kelley is the author. And then also you can go to romeocini.wordpress.com is one of my blogs. And you can go to academia.edu if you're part of that. I'm on there. And some of my work's on there that isn't available anywhere else. So other than that, hopefully we'll have more posts on Jay's analysis where you
Sure.
can.
There definitely, and I'll have a link, of course, with the interview to your blog and to the book. Um, and we look forward to more of this. Do you think, is there a possibility of a James Kelley book on cults? You suggested that idea. I thought it was great.
Sure. I mean, I look at all this as kind of building up to a book length project, a chapter on each of these things. So that's the whole idea, and that will take a while, but hopefully we'll see that.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks, James, and we look forward to talking to you soon.
Okay, Jay. Talk to you soon.